Hello Year 11 Extension 1, welcome back to Mathematics. I hope you're all well. What we're doing in this next video is we're looking at what happens when we graph the square root of a function. So we're seeing what happens when we graph a square root of a function. So here I have the dot point from the syllabus. We need to examine the relationship between the graph of y is equal to fx and the graph of y squared is equal to fx and f of x and y is equal to the square root of f of x, and hence sketch the graph. So what we're doing here, as we did in the last video with reciprocal functions, is if we get given an original function y is equal to f of x, what we want to be able to draw is two different functions based on a few different transformations that we've done to this original function. The first one is this one over here, y is equal to the square root of f of x. So what happens when we take the square root of a function? What happens to the graph, and what particular features do we need to be aware of? The second one is y squared is equal to f of x. So what happens when we graph this particular function when we square y? So these are the two graphs we're going to be dealing with in this lesson today. Now, before we get started with that, this section looks at square roots. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually have a look at what happens when we square root a number. So here I've actually got a few things that we want to have a look at. So we've got a few different conditions on our number. So here on the first column, I've got x, and we've got a few different conditions that we're having on x. We have on x, and we want to see what happens to that number when we square root it. So let's have a look at the first column. So the first column is when x is bigger than 1. So when x is bigger than 1, so for example 2, so let's put square root 2 into a calculator, and we get number 1.41. So here I'm going to put in 1.41. Now what do we notice? Well, we started off with 2 and we went to 1.41. So if x is bigger than 1, what we notice is that this number becomes smaller. So number becomes smaller. Okay, so that's the first thing that happens when that we need to notice when we have a number which is bigger than 1. So if the number is bigger than 1, the number becomes smaller. Okay, let's have a look at the next condition, which is a number between 0 and 1. So for example, I have x is equal to 0.5 or half. So let's put that into a calculator. So I'm going to go to square root 0.5 and we get 0.707. So here I notice I get 0.707. Now what do you notice between 0.5 and 0.707? Well, the number gets actually a bit bigger. So here, between 0 and 1, the number becomes bigger. So number becomes bigger. I'll write that in red so we match it. Number becomes bigger. Now, the last case is when we take a negative number. So a number which is less than 0. So for example, negative 1. So what happens when we put negative 1 into our square root? So I'm going to do square root negative 1. And we get math error. Now, if you remember, we actually talked about this. When we deal with square roots, we can't actually put a negative number into the square root because that square root doesn't allow it. We actually go into this next area of mathematics called imaginary numbers and imaginary and complex numbers. So here, when we put a negative number into our square root, we actually don't get a value. So here, we does not exist in the real numbers. So we are not dealing with complex numbers in this course yet. Or actually, we don't deal with it at all. So here, when our number is less than 0, number does not exist. Does not exist. It's just not there. Okay. Now, you might be wondering, so why are we doing this and checking out different numbers? Well, the reason why we need to know this is because these three conditions, and I should have done an extra one for 0, because when 0, we put a square root of 0, you get 0. But these three conditions are the conditions that are going to tell us what happens when we graph the square root function. So when we graph the square root function, these three conditions are going to be actually quite helpful in helping us determine the shape of a graph.